Hello and welcome to Talking Points. I'm Dave Kelly, Director of Advanced Media Production at Cal State Long Beach. Today we're going to talk about the future of urban life. What will cities look like and feel like in a post-pandemic world? My guest today is Alan Pullman. Mr. Pullman is an architect. He is also the founder and senior principal of Studio 111. Welcome, Alan, and thank you for joining us on Talking Points.
Thanks for having me. Oh, yeah,
I say
it's great
again,
to be back.
Yeah, because 6 years ago we spoke about a number of issues. Some of them are related to what we're going to talk about today. But what has changed is the fact that we've had a pandemic in the meantime. And as we're slowly trying to come out of that pandemic, even though we hear about a new variant almost every couple of months, but we are trying to bring back a sense of normalcy to the cities and the urban environments and everything that we do on a daily basis. So I want to start with a question about the pandemic and how it has changed the nature of urban life, how we live and work. And so what is your take on the pandemic and how it's changed the way we live and work? And what is the most important takeaway about the pandemic experience?
Well, I think it's important to understand that the pandemic probably accelerated trends that maybe we even talked about 6 years ago and pushed them even further along. So one of the ones that I think you mentioned a little bit, Dave, was working from home or hybrid work, where during the quarantine period, people couldn't go into the offices. Not everyone. There were some people that didn't have a choice. They had to go to work. But for a lot of people, working from home became an option. And even though the pandemic has somewhat eased and quarantine restrictions have eased, people are still working from home, white-collar workers especially. I think that's a trend that's here to stay, and it really has created some real changes to our cities, especially our downtowns, where there were large numbers of office workers populating restaurants, populating the streets, going shopping even. Those workers are gone, and I think it's changed the economy of our cities quite a bit. And cities are still trying to find out how to find their economic footing in this hybrid work world.
Well, let's talk about the renters and the consumers and the homeowners, and how have their expectations changed as a result of the pandemic experience?
Well, when you're talking about renters, we do a lot of multifamily housing in our office, and we talk a lot more about the importance of some basic things like having apartments with outdoor space and providing outdoor space, whether it's common space or potentially within the unit larger terraces. Natural light, really important. Developers need to provide high output internet, because people are working from home and they're needing that high frequency internet. And then even the common spaces like co-working spaces, which we used to have a little bit in our apartment buildings, now there's a lot more of that. Some of it is also marketing. A developer might market a 1-bedroom plus den now as a 1-bedroom plus study, or a 2-bedroom as a 1-bedroom plus office. So it's really changing the way we kind of talk about workspaces and home together.
So it sounds like what is necessary is some sort of access to the outdoors so that one can escape from just being in an enclosed environment all the time. And also the technology in the office space is what's really important, because people now need to have an area of the home that's a dedicated office space with that technology allowing them to work from home. So that leads to the next question, which is, with the technology application and the high-speed internet, as you're talking about, people can now live in San Bernardino County or Riverside County and work from home, whereas that was more difficult in the past. So why are people choosing, those that do choose, why are they choosing to go to Riverside or San Bernardino County? What's the attraction for that?
I think a lot of it is economic. I mean, you can buy more. You know, our coastal areas, for instance, talking about Southern California, our coastal areas are very expensive. They're going to stay very expensive. But if you go to the Inland Empire, you can get more space for less money. So I think there's an economic element to that. And people that are forming families are looking for yards. They're looking for more bedrooms. They can find that in the Inland Empire, where they can't afford to do that necessarily in the coastal, more expensive regions. So that's really, I think there's a large economic factor in that, and just less congestion and more space. That people always like that, actually, especially as they start families.
We noticed during the pandemic and in the summer of 2020 in particular, when we had that summer of riots and protests, that the crime rates skyrocketed during that summer, and it has continued to be higher than it was prior to the pandemic. So crime and safety is an issue. People are concerned about that, especially in the larger cities like LA and also New York City and Philadelphia and Minneapolis and Denver, and some of the medium-sized cities even experienced an increase in crime. So considering that that's the case, and urban life does have its challenges with congestion and traffic, we've already talked about the safety issues with crime, but why do people, given all of that, why do people decide to stay in the city, in the urban environment? What's attractive about staying within the urban environment in spite of all those challenges?
Well, for a lot of people that live in cities, what they love about it is the energy of a city, a downtown or a dense kind of inner ring suburb, the cultural amenities that cities have that you cannot find in the suburbs, and some of the other elements of just socializing, restaurants, a lot more food options, and even diversity. So it's a lifestyle choice for a lot of people, and they really enjoy cities in that regard.
So if we're talking about the livability of the city, what makes a city livable? And I think we're talking about humanizing the city too. What does it mean to humanize the city?
It's a good question. Humanizing the city has been a trend for a long time, but it's really picked up post-pandemic. And if you think about the city as a place that you're coming to work, or it's a place of commerce, with the pandemic that all stopped and the city became a place for people. We talk about how the city has to really be a place of well-being, a place of enhanced living for people, whether it's visitors or people that live there. So when we talk about humanizing the city, it's really turning the focus to what people need in a city: less congestion, more green space, because it's dense in a city and you need the green space. Other elements that really provide social interaction. Those are all the elements that we kind of think about when we talk about humanizing the city.
When we talk about urban cities, great restaurants have always been a tradition in the great cities: New York, LA, San Francisco, Chicago, and so forth. You know about the chefs in those cities and the great restaurants. So restaurants struggled a lot during the pandemic, especially when they had to close their doors altogether. And many of them had to survive on takeout orders, which is very difficult. And now that we're back and we do have dining, we did see some changes during the pandemic to help facilitate more restaurant access, opening up the streets for restaurants, shutting off streets to traffic, so automobile traffic, so people could sit outside and hang out, as it were, and do window shopping. So when we talk about that, what is the most important thing about access to restaurants and shopping and so forth in the cities that we didn't understand before the pandemic, but we understand now?
And it was a global trend. Cities all across the globe opened up to outdoor dining. Parking lots were taken over by dining plazas, and streets were closed for public spaces. It was almost like cafe society that you see really being brought to a lot of cities, where it didn't feel safe to be indoors, and so restaurants were able to still function by having the outdoor space. I think it's just about that street vitality that people liked. They loved being outside, and a lot of cities not only adopted it as an emergency measure, but continued it going forward with alfresco dining. There was a really fun term called streeteries, where it's street, but it's also an eatery at the same time.
That's an interesting term because it does define exactly what was going on. And I've seen this in a number of cities that I've been able to visit, like in Santa Barbara on State Street, for example. They do this in Laguna Beach. I think it's Forest Avenue is one of the streets that they do there. And so it really has revitalized those areas. And in some cases, maybe they were, as I mentioned before, they weren't doing as well as they would like to have done before the pandemic, but now they're more or less booming because it's a different kind of environment that people are responding to quite well, I think. So,
and both of those cities are going to make those programs permanent. Both State Street and Laguna Beach are going to make those permanent parts of their city.
That sounds like it's going to work well, given what I've seen. Let's talk about another concept called the 15-minute city. What is the 15-minute city?
The 15-minute city is an idea that was promoted by an urbanist out of France named Carlos Moreno, who posited that cities really should be about local neighborhood units, and that everything you need for your daily life, shopping, work, education, culture and entertainment, healthcare, should be within a 15-minute walk or bike ride from where you live. It's an idea that really harkens back to the idea of a city of villages, and really talks about the way cities used to be pre-industrial era. That's what the concept is. We live in industrial cities now, spread out cities, cities that really you get around by the car. So retrofitting those cities to become much more about neighborhood units is what the 15-minute city is about.
So the next question is there general consensus that the 15-minute city concept is a good idea? And if not, if there is no consensus, what is the counter argument to the 15-minute city?
I think that from a standpoint of that you can get anywhere within 15 minutes by walking or biking is great if you think about cities and lowering and improving their environmental performance. So you don't have to get in a car and drive an hour to get someplace. I think everyone wants to see more sustainable cities in that way. There is some pushback on the 15-minute city idea in the sense that a city is a big metropolitan region and you can't have everything within 15 minutes. It actually minimizes the importance of the larger cultural, economic facilities of a city. So there is some pushback to the idea that we can retrofit our cities to become medieval villages again.
I know when I first arrived in Los Angeles many, many years ago that someone said that don't think of Los Angeles as being this big metropolis where it's almost unmanageable if you think about it. Think about it as a series of distinctive kinds of neighborhoods or distinctive environments. And that kind of helped in terms of thinking about, okay, so now I know we're going to Santa Monica, I know we're going to Westwood, or we're going to downtown, we're going to Chinatown, etc. So is that part of what we're talking about, is bringing back the sense of community with specific neighborhood environments?
I think it is. I think like the Los Angeles region is a good example. It might be more amenable to this idea because it is what we call polycentric. So a city like Paris, which started the 15-minute city movement, is a very centralized city. But Los Angeles is very polycentric, where you talk about different neighborhoods, even different cities making up the region. So we are talking about really creating more distributed facilities throughout the city. So in any one area, you have all these different choices versus having to go to the center to find those opportunities.
And on that note, we have to go to the break. And when we come back from the break, we'll talk about suburban cities and what's happening with the suburban cities in the wake of the pandemic. Stay tuned.
Okay, Dad. 1, 2, 3. You saved me. Dad?
Are you okay?
I'm fine, dear.
Your hero needs you now, and AARP is here to help. Find the care guides you need at aarp.org/caregiving.
Welcome back to Talking Points. I'm Dave Kelly, and my guest today is Alan Pullman. Alan is an architect, and he's also the founder of Studio 111. Alan, before the break, we were talking about all of the different things that happened during the pandemic, particularly in the urban environment. So before we get to the suburban environment, which I mentioned in the tease, I'd like to talk about downtown redevelopment, and particularly with old office buildings, and how in large urban areas you often have older office buildings, especially after the pandemic, which may not be utilized anymore. So can we convert those older office buildings into residential units? And I'm thinking specifically about for low-income people or people on the lower end of the economic spectrum. Can that work, and will it be viable for the developers?
Well, there is a lot of vacancy in office space, and it hasn't been coming back post-pandemic. So there is probably surplus amount of office in our downtown business districts. We are actually working on several projects that are converting some office buildings into residential. We just finished one that's actually in downtown Long Beach. It's very viable if it's the right configuration. Not every building is well suited for that kind of conversion. The other thing, though, we've learned is it's expensive. And so it can be, the ones we've worked on, it's very viable for higher end housing. But to really see it as lower income housing, I think is going to be problematic. Because there's a lot of expense when you talk about a high-rise building and converting what was built for office use into residential use. There's a huge amount of infrastructure that needs to go in. You have to put in operable windows, life safety systems need to change. It's very expensive. So I don't see that as an easy pathway to more affordable housing, but it is a pathway for more housing in cities.
So it can be utilized for housing. It just may not be applicable for the lower income housing.
It's probably not the most applicable way of creating much needed affordable housing in our cities.
Well, maybe I should ask you that. What is the solution for lower income housing? How can that be managed?
We're going to have to put a lot more money towards it because it needs to be subsidized. I'd like to see less red tape. I think there should be a streamlined process, because taking a discretionary process where a city has to really review it and get a lot of input makes it more expensive for the developer. And so streamlining the process, looking at new technologies like modular and prefabrication can help us as well, because that could speed up the time frame. Really, time is money when it comes to construction. So anything that allows us to build faster, I think is going to help us build more affordably.
All right, well, let's move along to suburban housing and suburban neighborhoods. And before we went to the break, I said that we will be talking about what is happening with suburban neighborhoods in the wake of the pandemic. Well, one of the things that we know has happened and was accelerated by the pandemic was the use of Amazon and online shopping. Part of that technology evolution that we mentioned when people are moving out into the Inland Empire, because they can now work and communicate from far away. So, that being the case, it seems that we have a lot of shopping malls that are in trouble or in distress. Some have almost been completely abandoned, in fact. So, what can we do with that office space, or not office space, but retail space that exists in those more or less abandoned shopping malls? How can that large amount of real estate, including the parking lots, be repurposed?
It's true. And in fact, the US had more retail space per capita than any country. So we had too much retail space before the pandemic, before that accelerated rise of Amazon and online shopping. And with that retail excess is even greater. So I think people are in cities and developers are looking at how to convert big box stores that are empty into other kind of uses, whether it's healthcare or cultural centers, libraries, any kind of adaptive reuse to provide something for the community. We're also looking even at either tearing down portions of malls, keeping some of it that's still viable, tearing down portions of malls and adding things like much needed housing or park space. We're working on a project in Redondo Beach actually that does just that. It actually takes a large area of parking, creates a community park, and surrounds it with housing and more retail to help keep the mall vital, downsize the amount of retail, downsize the over amount of parking, and really provide something for the community.
Well, let's talk about one case in particular in Laguna Hills. I'm referring to the Laguna Hills Mall, where that is a mall that has been, I hate to say it, but it's been in decline for a number of years. And there have been some proposals to change that and to reinvigorate that mall and that mall space. I think you've been involved in some of those efforts. Tell us about that. What were you involved in with the Laguna Hills Mall?
And then this is also pre-pandemic, when one of the challenges with shopping malls is the consolidation and the closure of department stores. Shopping malls don't work well without department stores. And when Sears went out and JCPenney went out and Macy's announced the closure of that particular store, the mall was anchorless and it really wasn't viable anymore. So we worked on a plan to over time retrofit that mall with smaller, more outdoor spaces. People love outdoor malls. Outdoor spaces, a brand new state-of-the-art cinema, as well as restaurants, a much smaller retail footprint, and then lots of housing around the perimeter.
And at one point, that project was called the Five Lagunas. What was that all about?
Well, they were trying to name it and give it a brand, and it turned out that they couldn't really figure out one name. It was in Laguna Hills, but it was near Laguna Beach, Laguna Niguel, Laguna Canyon. So they just took all the lagunas around there and said, let's just call it Five Lagunas.
That name has been changed?
I don't know if they're still, I think they might be still using it. I'm not quite sure, but it's kind of catchy.
Well, that's interesting to talk about the evolution of projects. You have to start out with a concept, and then you have to have a name that is a good marketing hook. So how does that work? What do architects do when they are planning? Do they think about marketing? Does that occur in terms of, we have to sell this project? Tell us about that evolution and selling and marketing process.
Well, projects go through many cycles. So we worked on it years ago, and it changed and evolved as the economy changed and evolved. But we definitely think about marketing. We think about what the brand should be, how it connects to the community. We usually work with a marketing or branding consultant to put together an idea of what this project should be.
So for today's architect, it's not just about designing cool buildings. It's also thinking about marketing and how it can be sold and how it will fit into a changing culture and a changing society. So what does an architect need to know before starting on a big project like that?
Well, you have to build for resilience, and you have to build for change. That's really sort of one of the things that came out of this pandemic, but it was already there, that things evolve. Cities are complicated, and they're always evolving. So you have to build what we call the structure, the order that can stay, but understand that the tenants will come in and out, the operations will change. And you have to really build with that eye for resilience and what will make it sustainable. You have to think about how people will use the space too, but you can't totally plan it because people will use the space in ways you could never imagine.
And when we talk about the suburban environment, we talk about the post-World War II GI Bill and all of the servicemen coming back from the war and the government providing them with the GI Bill and access to affordable housing, meaning housing tracts, which were single-family homes, which was the American dream. And that's really what caused the country to boom after World War II, was all of that suburban development and all of the consumerism that followed because they built shopping malls to accompany those neighborhoods. So that goes back to the concept of one generation housing versus multiple generation of housing. So before the war, you had mothers and fathers and their children and their parents, the grandparents, and maybe even great-grandparents all living together. I think of the TV show The Waltons, actually, which sort of depicted that. But then after the war, things changed, as I just mentioned. So are we going to go back to multi-generational housing? And if so, why? And what is the trend?
Well, the trends that we're seeing is that there is a rise in multi-generational housing. And when we say multi-generational housing, we're talking about more than one adult generation living together. And there's been a trend actually since the 70s. It's been increasing pretty steadily. After the economic recession in 2008, it accelerated. But it's still probably going up to levels that we haven't seen since the pre-war era. I think there's a lot of reasons for that. One is just the economics and thinking about multi-generational families have less poverty, there's more income earners there, so that there's an economic kind of factor there for why people are choosing that lifestyle. The other is child care and adult care, taking care of each other's kids, adult parents. So there's a big component of that in multi-generational living. And thirdly, there's an emotional attachment to it. There are some immigrant communities where it's very natural. They've always lived that way. And with the rise of immigrants in our country, you'll see more and more of that. We've seen more and more of that in different kind of demographic sectors.
One of the issues in suburban neighborhoods today is that developers are saying we can provide housing in some of those neighborhoods that have small shopping centers or even medium-sized shopping centers where we can take out a large building that's no longer being useful or being used and put in multi-story housing. Well, the rest of the neighborhood is single-family housing that was built after World War II. And then there's usually a lot of pushback on that. Some people call it NIMBY, not in my backyard. Others say, well, it's just a natural reaction to the culture that's been developed for the last now 70 years after the war. So how do we balance what is the need of more housing with the traditional historic aspect of that neighborhood being single-family homes?
Good question, and balance is the word I would use. We have to find a balance. So how can we add housing in areas that have resources, that are close to jobs, great education, and allow more people to live there, but actually maintain what people love about those neighborhoods? And NIMBYism has gotten somewhat of a bad word, and I think there's a caricature of it, of just privileged, affluent neighborhoods saying no more new housing in our neighborhood. It's not really the case, at least from our perspective, because even areas, we work in a lot of different areas, even low-income neighborhoods don't want additional housing. They don't want more congestion. They say we're dense enough, and they have a right to say that just as much as affluent areas. So it's about finding the balance, finding unique solutions. We have this new program of ADUs, which are accessory dwelling units that are allowed by the state in backyards. Small little changes, but over a scale, actually can make a big difference in being able to add more housing to our neighborhoods.
Alan, we've got less than a minute left for the program. I wanted to give you a chance to talk about the future and what you see as the future and what trends will prevail in the future of the urban environment.
I think that the future will look a little bit like the past, and the things that we loved about cities, the amenities, the food, just a chance to meet and be with other people. People are the biggest attractor of people. So I think when we look at the city, we'll see technology, we'll see new devices and new ways of living, but in a lot of ways, what makes a city great has been historically just being with other people and enjoying that kind of lifestyle.
And on that note, we'll bring the program to a close, but thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Dave.
And thank you for joining us for this edition of Talking Points. Be sure to join us soon for another episode. Until then, I'm Dave Kelly. Have a nice day.